probing the president. Democrats begin an impeachment inquiry into Donald Trump over his phone call with the leader of Ukraine. We have team coverage, including analysis, plus reports from the White House and Capitol Hill. World Day for Migrants, a preview of an initiative by the Vatican to raise awareness to the plight of refugees. And fear the smear. Pope Francis warns the faithful against gossip and slander. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, September 25th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Capitol Hill is divided today as House Speaker Nancy Pelosi launches a formal impeachment inquiry against President Donald Trump. The move is followed by the release of a transcript of the president's phone call with Ukraine's president. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reports on the number of House Democrats now backing the impeachment inquiry.
Wyatt, 85% of Democrats now support this impeachment investigation. So I've been asking them what changes. They've already were investigating the president. They tell me this adds a new intensity, a new momentum to the investigations already underway. And plus, they now have the backing of a once cautious Speaker of the House.
Good afternoon.
Speaker Nancy Pelosi launches what she's calling an impeachment inquiry.
The actions of the Trump presidency revealed the dishonorable fact of the president's betrayal of his oath of office, betrayal of our national security, and betrayal of the integrity of our elections.
The last straw, President Trump asking the president of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden's son.
I think there is a whole henhouse of eggs now dripping off of Nancy Pelosi's face.
I asked lawmakers, what will this impeachment investigation mean for the 2020 election?
If you look at polling data across the country, there's not a real appetite for impeachment. You may disagree with the president. You may think he's made some bad decisions. But as far as high crimes and misdemeanors, I think most Americans say, it doesn't come up to that standard.
The 2020 Trump campaign manager says Democrats' actions will lead to a landslide re-election for the president. Are you worried about backlash, especially, in Florida? No. Why not?
No, because you got to do what's right. We took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America, and that's our job, and that's what we have to do on behalf of America.
Still, Democratic presidential candidate Tim Ryan warns his party.
We can't be so far to the left on some of these issues around jobs and health care and all of those things that those workers say, the president's a really messed up guy doing some really bad things, but these people over here want to take my job. And they plug their nose and they vote for the president.
Democrats say they want to act quickly on this impeachment investigation. It all intensified with the allegations brought forward against the president by a whistleblower. And this afternoon, the House and Senate Intelligence Committees will have their chance to review the whistleblower's complaint. Here at the Capitol, Jason Calvi, EWTN News Nightly.
President Trump disagrees with congressional Democrats on his phone call. The president says it shows he did nothing wrong. White House correspondent Mark Irons continues our team coverage. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. President Trump says he did not pressure Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden, whose son was on the board of a Ukrainian gas company. Now, this call transcript does debunk the notion that President Trump threatened to withhold military aid from Ukraine unless it investigated. But it does clearly show the president is pushing for action.
In a non-verbatim transcript, President Trump asked the president of Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Joe Biden and his son Hunter. I heard you had a prosecutor who was very good, and he was shut down, and that's really unfair. Hunter Biden worked for a Ukrainian gas company at the same time his father was vice president. In the phone call from this summer, the president continues, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that, so whatever you can do with the attorney general would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you can look into it. On the call, President Trump stops short of denying Ukraine military aid unless it follows through, but days before he did freeze nearly $400 million going to the country. President Trump says the transcript proves he's in the clear.
It turned out to be a nothing call, other than a lot of people said, I never knew you could be so nice.
Ukraine's president agrees he was not pressured.
I think, and you read it, that nobody pushed me. Yes.
In other words, no pressure.
And as Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi has announced a formal impeachment inquiry, the president responding today to how he feels about her leadership for the Democrats. He says as far as he's concerned, Nancy Pelosi is no longer the Speaker of the House. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. Iran's president tells the United Nations General Assembly his country will never forgive those who impose sanctions on Tehran.
من به نمایندگی از ملت و کشورم
Hassan Rouhani called those who backed the financial penalties criminals and accuses the United States of merciless economic terrorism. Tension has been rising between Tehran and Washington since President Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement with world powers. Also in New York, Saudi Arabia says it has given $500 million to the United Nations to help the relief effort in Yemen. The kingdom's foreign minister says overall, Saudi Arabia has donated around $14 billion to the catastrophe in Yemen. Tens of thousands of people have been killed in the ongoing conflict in the Middle Eastern country. It is considered the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The Vatican says the destruction of rainforests is an environmental, social, and ethical crisis. An address to the United Nations, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Holy See's Secretary of State, calls for a prompt and urgent response. He adds the destruction of forests leads to great human suffering. A senior Chinese official says he is confident local authorities can handle the unrest and restore calm in Hong Kong.
是根本，两制是这个在一国基础上的两制。
Some Hong Kong citizens say the comments from Beijing lead them to believe mainland China may not want to intervene. There have been months of pro-democracy demonstrations in the former British territory. More are scheduled for this weekend and for October 1st, the anniversary of the Communist Party rule in China. Thousands of college students storm a local government building in Indonesia. They were protesting a new law critics say will cripple the country's anti-corruption agency. The demonstrators say they will not stop until the new measure is revoked. A cabinet member in Britain says he will not apologize for his support for suspending Parliament earlier this month.
One thing we won't be apologising for is our commitment to respecting the people's priorities. We shan't be apologising for saying that we want to have a Queen's speech which concentrates on the NHS, education and crime, and we're not going to apologise for saying that we actually want to deliver Brexit.
Michael Gove says he respectfully disagrees with the UK Supreme Court ruling yesterday, saying the closing of Parliament was illegal. Lawmakers returned to the House of Commons today. Some members of the opposition party want Prime Minister Boris Johnson to resign. Johnson suspended Parliament in the hopes of making it easier for Britain to leave the European Union by October 31st. The Vatican is preparing for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees. It takes place this Sunday with a Mass in St. Peter's Square with Pope Francis. Each year, the Holy Father chooses a unique theme. Joining us from Rome is Father Michael Czerny, the Vatican's Undersecretary for Migrants and Refugees. He will be made a cardinal next week. Father, the Church has been celebrating the World Day of Migrants and Refugees since 1914. What is unique about the theme this year?
The theme is that it's not just about migrants, and it's the Holy Father is helping us to see how the questions that we might have about migrants and refugees are actually questions about our whole society and questions about how we, each one of us, lives our faith.
You have been called a new cardinal for the peripheries. Explain to us what Pope Francis means when he refers to the peripheries, and how can we as Catholics around the world best help those who are on the peripheries?
What periphery means depends on who you are. Who are the people who are outside of your sphere of interest and your sphere of comfort? Where do you draw the line between those who are us and those who are them? And so the invitation to go to the peripheries and meet the people there is one that applies everywhere, because all of us draw those lines around ourselves, and all of us are called by Christ to go that extra mile to meet the one who needs us.
You said in one of your recent interviews that it is very important for the Church to learn how to accompany popular movements. What did you mean by this?
Well, so when we talked, as you asked me about the peripheries there are people there, and they're not just sitting around suffering and sitting around waiting. They also organize themselves. They are also working out responses to the challenges that face them. And that's what we call popular movements, or that's one name for them anyway. And my hope is that the church will get to know the popular movements better, and that the popular movements will look to the church as an ally and indeed as a home.
Very good. Will you be a special secretary for the upcoming bishops' meeting on the Amazon region, what we call a synod? What do you hope to achieve in your position and as a cardinal with this synod?
Well, my position is to help the rapporteur or relator, who is Cardinal Humes of Brazil, to produce the final report. That's my mission during the synod, and I very much hope we'll be able to do a good job gathering everything that is said and experienced into a inspiring and forward-looking final document.
Well, Father, I want to ask you about the timing here. Why do you think the church chose to have this meeting on the Amazon now?
Well, the church, the Holy Father decided several years ago to have the meeting, so it's because it's an urgent issue, and I think the recent fires brought that home to people in a very powerful image, a very powerful footage that alarmed us deeply. So the timing I would call providential. Here is, if you'll pardon the expression, a burning issue which the church is trying to grasp and respond to in the light of Christ's teaching and of the social teaching of the church.
We at EWTN, of course, will be covering this synod. We have writers, producers, reporters who will be there. So it's so insightful for us to get some learning about what is going on inside the Vatican in preparation for that synod. Father Michael Czerny, the Vatican's Undersecretary for Migrants and Refugees and a Cardinal-elect. Thanks so much for being with us.
It's a great pleasure. Good night.
Coming up, analysis on the impeachment push against President Trump. Tonight, we take a closer look at President Trump's historic speech this week before the UN General Assembly, calling upon world leaders to end religious persecution. Joining me now to offer her insights is Kristina Arriaga. She's a longtime religious freedom advocate. She's also a commissioner with the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, also known as USERF. Kristina, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
What was your reaction to the president's remarks?
Oh, it was incredible. I mean, it's very, very rare that a president goes to the United Nations General Assembly and decides to address religious freedom, which has been treated by the UN as the poor little sister of the human rights community for a long time. So he reminded the world that Americans view religious freedom as a core and vital human right, because religious freedom is not about who God is, it's about how we are as human beings. We're born with dignity. We're born with the right to live according to our deeply held convictions.
Why do you think it's been at the UN that they've seemed to ignore those values for so long, or haven't taken it as seriously, I should say?
Unfortunately, the UN has become an enormous bureaucracy where countries that do not respect religious freedom, like China and Cuba and Russia, all have enormous power over countries that have a vote-taking ability there. So I think that these countries have pressured the bureaucracy into ensuring that religious freedom is not considered a vital human right.
The president cited staggering figures in his speech: 11 Christians killed every day just for practicing their faith, 80% of the world's population living in countries where religious liberty is threatened. What would it take to get these governments worldwide to actually make religious freedom a priority?
The figures are indeed staggering. And what the president did, in essence, was to say we need to fundamentally change the way we look at these problems, and we need to change the way we resolve them. So he announced a new global initiative to engage and leverage the power and success of corporations for the common good. In other words, he invited corporations to also make sure that within their businesses and in places where they operate, that religious freedom is respected.
Okay, let me follow up with you on that, because that's a good point. Because President Trump spoke passionately about attacks on houses of worship as well, and getting other sectors involved with that. So how do we involve the global community, not just governments, into protecting our sacred spaces?
A lot of corporations have terrific programs that have been very successful at helping others. And this is an idea that resonates in the United States. Only a few weeks ago, the Business Roundtable had issued a statement signed by 181 CEOs saying no longer is the only purpose of the corporation to increase value for the shareholder, increase profit, but we must invest in making sure that all of our stakeholders live a life with meaning and dignity. Look at what JP Morgan is doing, for instance. The chairman of the Business Roundtable is also the CEO of this mega million-dollar company, and they invest their resources in helping veterans get jobs, in ensuring that veterans are trained so they can transition out of military service. Imagine if those corporations were also investing in ensuring that all faith-based organizations and all people around the world can live with meaning and dignity, and that is according to their deeply held religious convictions.
One question real quick. What do you think? You've been studying this for decades. Are we getting better or worse globally in terms of religious freedom?
Well, the numbers are in. And the Pew Report, which is a nonpartisan organization, just put out a 10-year report saying that religious freedom has unfortunately declined all over the world.
Okay. So we'll obviously have to continue to cover this and obviously let people know about what is going on all around the world. Kristina Arriaga, Commissioner with the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom and longtime religious freedom advocate. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
The former leader of the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis has died. Archbishop Harry Flynn led the Archdiocese in Minnesota from 1995 to 2008. He also chaired a commission of U.S. bishops on the sex abuse crisis from 2002 to 2005. Archbishop Flynn had been battling bone cancer. He was 86 years old. For more on this story, including a closer look at Archbishop Flynn's accomplishments and controversies, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. Up next, a historical look at impeachment proceedings against U.S. presidents. Plus, Pope Francis has a warning about gossip.
Ma uomini e donne in carne e ossa che, come dice l'Apocalisse,
Pope Francis says slander and gossip are cancers. During his weekly talk to pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father says those who smear others are only trying to cover up their own faults. Instead, the faithful should try to be like St. Stephen, because the first martyr always spoke the truth. As House Speaker Nancy Pelosi launches a formal impeachment inquiry against President Donald Trump, it raises the possibility that he could become the fourth president in American history to face the process. Presidents Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton were both acquitted after trials in the Senate. President Richard Nixon resigned to avoid being impeached in the Watergate scandal. Joining me now to offer his perspective is John Gizzi, chief political columnist and White House correspondent for Newsmax. John, welcome back.
Thank you, Wyatt, and a pleasure to be back.
Sure. You covered the impeachment proceedings against former President Bill Clinton. What's one key difference that sticks out in your mind between then and now?
Bill Clinton's entire Democratic Party was front and center for him. The day after he was impeached in 1999, they all gathered on the White House lawn with him. There was an emotional talk by several members of the House and Senate, and Vice President Gore introduced him as our great president. There was no doubt they were geared up for a fight. Right now, the fight has been carried on by Team Trump's captain, and he has not yet assembled everyone around him, and I think that that has to come later. Right now, I think a lot of Republicans are hoping this doesn't metastasize into a major impeachment drive and dies in the House.
Yeah, because Senate Republicans have been quick to blast all the calls for impeachment against President Trump. The Republicans, of course, as you know, control the Senate. So how likely is it that any of these potential charges are dismissed before we even get to a Senate trial?
Zero. And this is what I think will happen. If the House goes ahead and impeaches him, as Republicans did with Bill Clinton, I do believe then that there will be a move to dismiss all the charges against him in the Senate. Remember, Bill Clinton's Senate was controlled by Republicans. The opposite party, Donald Trump, is controlled by Republicans, his party. Hence, there's almost no likelihood he would be convicted on any count that's offered, and it may be squelched before it comes to a trial presided over by Chief Justice John Roberts.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, up until now, has seemed hesitant to move forward with an impeachment. How risky a move is this politically, even within our own party?
Polls show that most Americans do not want Donald Trump impeached. Even those who don't approve of his performance don't want to see an impeachment go through. In addition, the economy is stronger than it's ever been in recent years. So to actually impeach and force a trial on the nation could produce blowback for the Democratic Party right before an election year.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me follow up with you on that. How do you think then in general does this change, or does it really change the landscape ahead of the 2020 election?
Well, I don't think it changes it because, again, the interpretation of the president's conversation with Ukrainian President Zelensky, whether he used strong-arm tactics to get information on a potential rival, and whether that's an impeachable offense, all have to be determined. I think the American public is just waiting and seeing, but right now they don't want impeachment, and forewarned is forearmed. Republicans in 1998 insisted on pushing this against President Clinton during the midterm elections, and to the point of bringing up quotes that he had made that could be embarrassing. President Clinton told an associate he felt like Sammy Sosa warming up for a pitch, and sure enough, Democrats almost won the House back and would have short-circuited impeachment.
Very interesting. Obviously, so many questions left ahead for President Trump, but it's so good to get your perspective on all of this. John Gizzi, Chief Political Columnist and White House Correspondent for Newsmax. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Wyatt. Always a pleasure.
And that wraps up our newscast for tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.